Greetings, survivors. ResilientZ back with another video. As you all know, the Lightbringer League is coming to an end, and we finally have our two finalists. MVPia from state number 763 in Thunderblade, who recently joined state number 333. Before diving into the upcoming finals, I want to highlight MVPia's incredible journey. She's taken down some big names on her road to the finals, including Soth from her own state and Supreme from state number 963. Today's video is all about reviewing MVPia's remarkable path, breaking down the key battles she's fought, and the obstacles she's overcome to secure her spot in the championship match. First, let's review her match against Supreme in the knockout stages, which secured her spot in the top 8 of this league. Here's how their March lineups looked. Match number 1. MVPia's Berserk March went up against Supreme's Control March. Judging by the power difference, it seems Supreme didn't have a behemoth in this lineup. Match number 2. MVPia's ResilientZ March faced off against Supreme's Berserk March. Match number 3. MVPia's Control March went against Supreme's ResilientZ March. Let's dive into the battle reports and see how things unfolded. First of all, match number 1. MVPia's Berserk versus Supreme's Control. Supreme didn't have a behemoth in this March, and the result was extremely one-sided. MVPia won comfortably, finishing with 298,068 surviving troops. Since there's not much to analyze from such a lopsided battle, we'll skip the details here. There's nothing useful to break down. Secondly, match number 2. MVPia's ResilientZ versus Supreme's Berserk March. Judging from the power, this was clearly Supreme's main march. Supreme did manage to win this round, but it came at a heavy cost. He lost almost half of his troops in the process and finished with just 162,562 surviving troops. Next, match number 3. MVPia's Control versus Supreme's ResilientZ March. Judging by the power, this was MVPia's march without a behemoth. Even so, it still cost Supreme nearly 100,000 troops to win this fight. He wrapped up the match with 197,897 surviving troops, so after the first 3 battles, Supreme was leading 2-1, but both players still had their main marches available. Let's move forward and see how the rest of this intense battle unfolded. Match number 4. MVPia's Berserk versus Supreme's Berserk. This was a main versus main battle and easily the most important match of the series, so let's dive into the full details. MVPia went into this fight with almost a full march and secured a comfortable win, ending with 227,663 surviving troops. On the other hand, Supreme only had around half a march left going into this round, so pulling off a win here would have been difficult right from the start. Let's take a closer look at the battle details and see how MVPia managed to dominate this crucial fight. First up, let's check the hero section. Both MVPia and Supreme had the exact same setup for their infantry heroes. They were both using Shadow Infusion as the Gene Link and Torment as the genetic recombination skill. Moving on to the riders. Again, both players used the same rider hero with the same Gene Link, Pulse Storm. However, there was one key difference in their genetic recombination skills. MVPia went with Torment, while Supreme was running Surging Might on his rider. Moving on to Hunters, both Supreme and MVPia were using Torment as their genetic recombination skill. The difference here was in their gene links. MVPia was using Berserk Serum, while Supreme had Energy Overflow. Now let's check out their Tempest Arms setup. Both players were using S1 Tempest Arms for infantry. Supreme had Sacred Oath Infantry 3 and Rejuvenating Spring 4, and interestingly, MVPia was running the exact same setup with both of these skills on her infantry as well. Of course, their actual stats wouldn't be exactly identical, but the skill choices were a perfect match. Now for Rider Tempest Arms, MVPia was using the Hitman Tempest Arms, while Supreme was still sticking with the S1 Tempest Arms. MVPia's riders were equipped with Data Corruption 4, a new ultra-rare skill, and Marking Trap 4, a rare skill, both introduced with the Hitman collaboration event. On the other hand, Supreme had Overpower 4 and Mark of Fury 4 on his riders. Finally, for Hunters, both MVPia and Supreme were rocking the new Hitman Tempest Arms. MVPia had Assassination Trap 3 and Assassination Trap 4 as her Tempest skills on Hunters. Interestingly, Supreme was using the exact same skill setup on his Hunters as well. Before we check out the stats of both players, let's take a look at their energy conversion units, or simply known as gems. MVPia clearly had the edge here. She's equipped with some very nice and rare level 9 amplification gems, along with Hero Final Damage and Hero Final Damage Reduction gems. Overall, a very impressive gem setup that definitely gave her an advantage going into this match. Now let's look into the stats. Even though MVPia had lower total combat morale, it didn't really matter here because of the morale limit cap in battles. Where MVPia really pulled ahead was in behemoth damage and reduction stats, as well as aircraft damage and reduction stats. This advantage partly came from her rider's Hitman Tempest Arms, which Supreme wasn't using. For infantry, both players had nearly equal stats, except for damage bonus and damage reduction, where Supreme had the upper hand. For riders, most of the stats were quite close, but MVPia had a huge lead in rider attack, with almost 500% more than Supreme. For Hunters, both players had nearly identical stats with only minor differences here and there. For the final match, it was MVPia's Berserk going up against Supreme's ResilientZ March. It wasn't much of a battle here, MVPia dominated comfortably. With this final victory, she successfully defeated Supreme and secured her spot in the next round. Now for her next knockout round, MVPia had to face Soth, currently the #1 player on multiple global leaderboards in State of Survival. How did their battle go? Let's jump right in and check it out. Right off the bat, match #1 was a clash between MVPia's main March and Soth's main March. MVPia pulled off a clever trick here by using Shizuka, a control rider, in her main March instead of the usual Penelope. This unexpected move paid off, as she secured the win with 140,167 surviving troops. Now, let's dive into the details of this battle and see how this decision made the difference. For the heroes, both Soth and MVPia had the exact same setup for infantry. On riders, their setups were also nearly identical with Pulsestorm as the Gene Link and Torment as the genetic recombination skill. The only difference being that MVPia used Shizuka, while Soth stuck with Penelope. Finally, for Hunters, both players had the same setup as well, using Berserk Serum as the Gene Link and Torment as the genetic recombination skill. Now let's look at their Tempest Arms setup. For infantry, Soth was running Sacred Oath Infantry 3 and Sacred Oath Infantry 4, giving him a clear upper hand with both levels of this amazing Tempest Arms skill. On the other hand, MVPia had Sacred Oath Infantry 3 paired with Rejuvenating Spring, which is good, but not as impactful as Soth's double Sacred Oath combo. For riders, both Soth and MVPia were rocking the new Hitman Tempest Arms. In terms of skills, Soth was using Data Corruption 3 and Data Corruption 4, while MVPia went with Data Corruption 4 and Marking Trap 4. Finally, for Hunters, both players were running the exact same setup, using Assassination Trap 3 and Assassination Trap 4. This was a truly amazing, top-level setup from both players, very impressive indeed. Now let's look at their gems before moving on to the stats comparison. Overall, Soth had the clear edge here. All his gems were level 9, with not a single lower level gem in sight. Meanwhile, MVPia had a mix, with some level 8 in her setup. Not low by any means, but when compared to Soth's fully maxed gems, he definitely had the advantage in this department. Now let's look at the stats comparison. Since MVPia's combat morale during the battle was higher than Soth's, the extra damage from her combat morale stats definitely played a vital role in this fight. Other than that, there were no major differences in their stats. Both players were pretty evenly matched across the board. For infantry stats, Soth had the edge when it came to amplifications, but other than that, there wasn't any real difference between the two. For rider stats, MVPia had a noticeably higher rider attack, while Soth held the advantage in rider lethality and amplification stats. When it came to hunters, Soth again had the upper hand with better hunter lethality and amplification stats. That's it for match number 1. Moving on to match number 2, it was MVPia's ResilientZ going up against Soth's ResilientZ March. Soth did come out on top, but barely. He won this battle with just 59,045 surviving troops left. For match number 3, it was MVPia's control versus Soth's control. Soth did manage to win, but just barely. He finished with only 28,097 surviving troops, so even though the score was 2-1 in Soth's favor at this point, MVPia still had her main march intact with almost 140,000 troops, while Soth had already lost his main march and his second and third marches were almost wiped out. As expected, MVPia comfortably won the 4th and 5th battles, securing her victory and qualifying for the semifinals. In the semifinals, MVPia faced another tough challenger, this time from ELF. For match number 1, it was main versus main for both players, and interestingly, nobody won. It was a complete draw with both players ending the battle with 0 surviving troops. You don't get to see battles like this every day, so let's dive into it and see how it all went down. Since we've already covered MVPia's setup twice now, let's focus on ELF's setup this time. For infantry, ELF was using Berserk Decay, which is definitely a very strong skill choice. On riders, ELF was also running Berserk Decay, which is a bit surprising. Additionally, instead of using Penelope, ELF went with Shizuka, pulling the same trick MVPia used earlier against Soth. For hunters, ELF was again using Berserk Decay along with Neural Overdrive. I don't think Neural Overdrive is strong enough to be part of a Berserk march, and it's quite surprising to see ELF running Berserk Decay across all 3 troop types. Very interesting indeed. Now let's check out ELF's Tempest Arms setup. For infantry, ELF was using Sacred Oath Infantry 4 and Data Disruption 4, a strong mix of sustain and utility. On riders, ELF had Peerless Power 4 and Marking Trap 4. Honestly, Peerless Power isn't really considered a top-tier skill for this type of matchup. For hunters, ELF was running 2 Mark of Fury 4 skills. It's also worth noting that ELF wasn't using any of the new Hitman Tempest Arms, which means he'd naturally have some disadvantage when it comes to behemoth damage, aircraft damage, and hero final damage, since those are part of the Hitman Tempest Arms set bonus. Now let's go straight to the stats comparison. As expected, MVPia had a slight advantage in behemoth damage and aircraft damage stats, thanks to her Hitman Tempest Arms set bonus. For infantry, MVPia had a noticeable edge in infantry defense stats as well as amplifications, while ELF had the upper hand in damage bonus and reduction. For riders, MVPia again had the advantage in amplifications and rider lethality, whereas ELF led in damage bonus and reduction. Similarly, for hunters, MVPia had the edge in amplifications, damage bonus and reduction, and also a slight advantage in hunter attack, 2 very strong players indeed. The first match ended in a complete tie, with both players finishing with 0 troops left. In the next 2 matches, MVPia came out on top in both, securing the overall victory against ELF and successfully making it to the finals. And now in the finals, MVPia will face another very tough challenge, Thunderblade. Who will win this match? Will MVPia continue her amazing winning streak, or will Thunderblade be the one to stop her and become the champion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. MVPia definitely surprised a lot of people by reaching the finals and toppling some very big names along the way. If you enjoy my content, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.